I ordered him to do as I say or find someone else at family dinner. He smirked, stood up, and left. For privacy's sake, every name mentioned here will not be the real names of the people involved. Hello, Reddit. My name is Emerald, and I'm 26 years old. I am the CEO of my father's shipping company, and I'm the only child of my parents. This is my first time writing on this app, and I came here to just vent. All my life, I've never thought I'd be anything less or be looked down upon because I was born into a wealthy family. I had people older than me respecting me and my wishes. I wanted anything. I got it. No, I've got to have it. And even in my relationships, I was always the one ending things when I didn't feel the spark anymore. You could call me a real-life princess. Money gave me the power I needed, and I've always craved control in whatever I do. That need to control everything and have my way with everything has now ended up ruining everything that I've ever had the privilege of having. Actually, it affected just one part of my life, but that part has ended up ruining everything else all around. I have, or should I say I had, a fiancé. His name is Andrew, and we've been together for 3 years. Andrew had been the best man I could ever have met in my life. Gentle, kind, romantic, and even a good listener. He was simply the sweetest, and all my friends envied our relationship. Andrew is a quick thinker, and he provides solutions to everything almost immediately. He is also really handsome, with his two-sided dimples that appear anytime he smiles. He had this friendliness that drew people to him, yet to those he worked with, he was really strict. We met through work, and getting together with him had been the best decision I made in my life, but I ruined things. I ended up ruining everything because I was stupid and selfish. Andrew actually worked for my father before he decided to take a back seat and let me take the reins. My dad had bragged about him being his best worker, and I thought he was exaggerating until I started working with Andrew myself. He made work so easy because of how efficient and coordinated he was. It was very easy to like him as a person and then later as a man. I fell for Andrew first. He was my employee and, of course, didn't want to take things further between us. Also, because of the company rules, he was hesitant, but I didn't mind all that. I wanted Andrew, and I made sure I got him. When Andrew and I started dating, we did so in secret because we didn't want anyone knowing about our relationship, mostly because Andrew didn't want to lose his job. I wasn't exactly comfortable sneaking around like teenagers who couldn't be caught together, so I managed to convince my dad to remove that rule from the company's policies. It was only when I convinced my dad to discuss with the rest of the board and remove the rule, as it wasn't exactly relevant to work ethics, that I introduced Andrew to my family as my boyfriend. My parents were pretty happy because they knew Andrew to be a good man. Everything was good from then. A year into our relationship, Andrew started to talk about marriage, but I dismissed it, thinking he was discussing it generally. But he proposed to me for the first time on my 24th birthday. Thankfully, it was just him and me alone because I had decided not to have a party that year, despite all the objections from my friends and even parents. I rejected his proposal because I wasn't ready to be married and saddled with the responsibilities of being a wife, including kids and other wifely duties. And then there was my career aspect. Despite being a daddy's girl and always allowed my way, I don't joke with my job. I am a very career-oriented person and believed that marriage would distract me from proving to my dad and the board of directors that I was a worthy CEO. Andrew had been really upset about my refusal, but he eventually got over it when I convinced him that marriage wasn't the best decision at that time. We continued our relationship as two people in love, and it was just the best. I moved in with Andrew during our second year of being together, and although my parents protested, they didn't enforce that I couldn't. Living with Andrew was a great experience, to be honest. Andrew was very neat and organized, and it wasn't only at work. He would get up really early, clean the apartment, make breakfast, and wake me up to get ready for work. For someone as messy as me, who cannot pick up after herself, it was refreshing having someone like that around. Like I wrote before, things between us were just perfect. Andrew drove us to and from work, made us dinner, and when we were too tired, we would order in and go to bed. Well, I ended up ruining my perfect relationship. Because of how Andrew behaved and handled everything, I unconsciously thought of him as a subordinate, and before long, I started treating him like one too. Andrew didn't complain at first, and I thought the things I said or did to him were normal. But then Andrew grew uncomfortable with the way I spoke to him, both at work and at home, and he started to complain about it. But I didn't see anything wrong with the things I said. Like one time, I jokingly told him that I was the one indirectly feeding him because I approved his paycheck every month. And also because it was my dad's money, which automatically was mine too. The problem wasn't what I said, it was where I said it. We were having dinner with our friends, whom we invited over for the weekend, and everyone was complaining about the cost of things. Andrew had chipped in his own view, and it was then that I laughed and said it. But instead of everyone laughing with me as I expected, they just kept quiet until another one of our friends broke the awkward silence with another topic. I didn't understand what I said wrong because I was right. He was getting paid through me, right? Andrew had not been exactly happy about what I said, and when he brought it up that evening after our friends were gone, I got so angry instead of apologizing. I said mean things to him and proceeded to ignore him for 2 days, even though we lived and worked together. Andrew had still been the one to try and settle things between us. It made me think of him as the weaker person between us. I had all the power and money, and he survived on the little he earned working for me. So several times from then on, I didn't filter my choice of words with him, and now that I think of it, I realize that it made us drift even further apart. We barely sat together in the living room, cuddling while watching a movie that was picked through the game of rock, paper, and scissors, where the winner got to choose what we watched. Most times, I was always the winner because Andrew allowed me to win. We didn't eat lunch together at a nearby restaurant just to spend time together, and we didn't even go home together anymore. I was either leaving the office for a meeting at another location, or I just left without informing Andrew. At night, he didn't snuggle with me anymore or kiss me goodnight. We drifted apart even while being in a relationship, and the funny part was, I felt too proud to even try and address the issue. I didn't want to look weak by apologizing, so I let things go from bad to worse. I knew it was only a matter of time before Andrew broke things off with me because of how things were going, so I did the only thing I thought was necessary. I decided to announce our engagement. No, Andrew didn't propose to me again, at least not after the first time when I had looked at the cheap ring on his finger like I was disgusted. He made no mention of marriage since then, but I thought that announcing our engagement would bring things back to what they were between us. So I forced Andrew to go with me to dinner with my parents. Before that time, I had bought myself a huge diamond ring that was noticeable from a distance and slipped it on before entering my parents' house. My mom noticed the ring first and screamed excitedly while my dad tapped Andrew on the back, congratulating him. Andrew had been so shocked that he didn't utter a word throughout dinner. My mom and I discussed our wedding preparations while Andrew settled with updating my dad about work. When we finally got home, Andrew demanded answers. I told him I thought it was time we got married and that I wanted to save him the stress of going on his knees a second time. Andrew was really pissed at me, but he eventually forgave me. And for a while, things went back to normal between us. To a reasonable extent, though. Andrew went back to being concerned about my affairs, and I was really happy. I didn't have to really apologize, and everything went back to the way it was. It was a win-win situation for me, but somehow I just kept finding ways to break the happiness in our relationship. And this time, No, I know that I went too far. I cheated. I cheated on Andrew with Steve, my ex. Steve. He was my worst relationship, and yet for some reason, I still found my way back to him. I was in a toxic relationship with Steve for almost a year, and it nearly ruined my life. Steve was an arrogant and proud human being. He never saw the need to apologize whenever he did things he should be sorry for. He was manipulative, and he almost destroyed my self-confidence because of how badly he treated me. I met Steve when I was just freshly admitted into university. Steve's parents are actually very rich, even wealthier than my own parents. He was the only person who wasn't intimidated by my parents' wealth. My parents had insisted that I go to a public university because, according to them, they wanted me to mingle with other, less privileged people. They wanted me to learn to interact with them and also be grateful for what I had. But it seemed everyone I met was actually intimidated by my parents' wealth. Some didn't want to be friends with me, while others only wanted to get closer for job opportunities. Although I eventually got friends whom I thought were true friends, meeting Steve was really relieving, and I was happy when he asked me to be his girlfriend. But then, 2 months into the relationship, I realized exactly who Steve really was. He made sure I had no friends, not because he directly chased them away, but because he manipulated me into believing they were all bad. I only discovered later that he was actually sleeping with them, and he didn't want them slipping and telling me. Steve cheated on me several times while we were together, and each time I found out, he made me believe it was my fault. It was either I couldn't satisfy him enough, I wasn't making him happy, or he came up with some other silly excuse. It just kind of happened. It doesn't even mean anything to me. It shouldn't mean anything to you. You're the one I'm with, not them. He said things like that, but for some reason, I still stuck with him until I almost became really depressed. Funny how, despite everything he did to me, I wasn't even the one who ended the relationship. He apparently found someone new and didn't want the new person finding out about me. I had to transfer from that school to another one where I got my degree because it was all too much for me. I couldn't deal with his level of betrayal, so I had to just leave. Now I'm sure you're wondering how and why exactly I would cheat on a man as wonderful as Andrew with a man like Steve. Well, it just sort of happened. I didn't plan for it or anything, and it was a stupid decision, honestly. I met Steve again after so long when work brought us together. He wanted to import some goods using our services, and I attended to him personally because he apparently insisted on seeing me. I tried not to let the past between us infiltrate into our work lives. I knew in my head that Steve hurt me in the worst possible way and that I couldn't let it interfere with work, but somehow I found myself revisiting the past. I was angry. I didn't get the closure I deserved because I left right after he broke things off with me. Seeing him again, looking all smug, made me angry. And Steve didn't exactly make things easy for me. Instead of talking about work, which was what brought us together in the first place, he was asking me how I was and informing me about how much he had missed me. When he asked if I was in a relationship, to be honest, I lied. Not because I didn't love Andrew or anything, but because I knew Steve would mock me if he ever found out that my fiancé worked in the same company I managed. I didn't want him looking down on Andrew. Well, to be honest, I didn't want him looking down on me. I didn't tell a total lie, though. The ring on my hand would have refuted all of my lies anyway. I told him I did have a fiancé, but I lied about who he was and where he worked. I gave the impression that Andrew was some big shot. Steve didn't mind all of that, though. He was apparently married already if the gold band on his left finger was anything to go by. But he didn't mention it, and when I asked, he waved off my question with a casual shrug, which wasn't a yes or no, now that I think about it. He was dismissing it so I wouldn't find an excuse not to see him. A married man. He wanted to have me, and he didn't make an attempt to even hide it. And for some weird reason, it made me feel powerful. Seeing him react to me like that made me feel great for still having that sort of effect on him after so many years. Then he invited me to lunch with him the next day, and I accepted the offer. Not because I wanted to, but Steve knew exactly the right words to say to get me to do his will again. He didn't need a lot of words to convince me into accepting to meet him for lunch. That evening, when Andrew asked about the rich-looking dude that had come to my office and apparently spent a whole lot more time than was necessary to discuss business, I lied again. For the second time that day. I told him that he was just a client. I didn't mention the invitation to lunch or the fact that Steve was actually my ex. I successfully edited those vital details out, and I was relieved when Andrew didn't ask further questions. I went out with Steve the next day for lunch under the pretense of work, and he made sure that I knew just what money could do that afternoon, as if he was reminding me of who he really was. We dined at one of the finest restaurants and were literally treated like royalty. Steve ordered their finest wine, and we ate their most expensive dish. By the end of the afternoon, I was feeling like a pampered princess, so much so that when he asked if we could meet again, I didn't hesitate to give a positive response. This time, it was dinner, and I had a swell time again. But this time, when Steve dropped me off back at my office, as I had insisted because my car was back there, he kissed me on the lips. My first mistake was that I hadn't pushed him away and slapped him across the face while warning him never to try it again. I had allowed him. I had even crazily fluttered my eyelids closed and allowed him full access to my lips. I went home feeling really giddy, and when Andrew asked me how the work date with the client and his wife went, I told him it went well. I didn't feel any regret or guilt. It was only a kiss, not sex. And what Andrew didn't know couldn't hurt him, right? Steve, of course, had his plans set in motion for me. He had 100 bouquets of flowers delivered to me the next day at work, thanking me for the night before. Andrew was clearly shaken by the reason a married couple would send me 100 flowers just to thank me for a supposed business meeting. but I managed to convince him that both couples were very romantic and thought it was ideal to send me flowers after I told them about our upcoming nuptials. Andrew didn't argue or say anything about it, and I thought I had gotten away with it. Soon enough, another tempting invitation came from Steve, but this time, instead of a lunch or dinner date, it was a 3-day all-paid trip to Paris. I couldn't even bring myself to reject the offer. I gave myself the excuse of going on a break from work, and since there was someone who wanted to foot the bill, it was nothing, even if that someone was my ex. I lied to Andrew that it was a trip with my friends. I didn't want him suspecting me. It didn't matter that only 2 friends were actually not even available for a trip at all, with one tending to her sick mother and the other caught between her 9-to-5 day job, which apparently didn't leave space for a trip. It didn't matter because Andrew didn't know that, and to him, I was taking a break from work and going with my friends on a trip. My 3-day trip was when I first cheated on Andrew with Steve. Although he got us different hotel rooms, I stayed mostly in his own room when I wasn't out shopping and having fun. I thought of those 3 days as the best times of my life, ever since knowing Steve. He wanted to prove to me that he had really changed and that he wanted me. The whole trip managed to convince me that he actually had changed, so much that I didn't reject his offer to share his bed on the last night of the trip. Truly, I had been in the same room as he was throughout the entire trip, but Steve didn't touch me because he wanted to prove how much I meant to him and how much he respected me. There wasn't exactly much he was doing other than spending the money he had in excess, but I felt so touched that when he reached for me that night, I allowed him. I allowed him to kiss me and touch me everywhere and in every way imaginable, and then finally, we had sex. After having sex with Steve, I waited for the guilt to come, but it didn't. And it didn't come until I came down from the plane and was headed towards the apartment I shared with Andrew. It didn't help matters that Andrew had been so excited to see me. He had set up a romantic dinner for us with all the candles, petals, and even wine. I couldn't even look at him without feeling the need to spill my guts and confess my sins. So I made excuses about being tired from the trip and needing to rest, then went to take a bath, as if that would erase the memories of what I had done. But a bath clearly didn't erase what you've done. Because I lay wide awake in bed all night that day, recounting what I had just done while Andrew slept. My guilt didn't exactly stop me from seeing Steve again, neither did it stop me from having sex with him again. I don't know how, but for some reason I just couldn't stop sleeping with Steve. I knew he was married, evidently, even though he was always dodging questions about his wife whenever we were together. The ring never left his finger unless we were both naked in bed. And then, when we were dressed and ready to leave, he would never forget to put it back on right where it was before. And there was the fact that I was engaged to Andrew, and although not planning a wedding at the time, it still didn't erase that fact. Steve wasn't even a changed man. He was still as arrogant and manipulative as ever. I guess that's one reason his wife stays married to him, and I still keep being his mistress. He still didn't consider my feelings. He was still as bossy as he was before. The exact change he claimed to have had over the years? I saw none of that. And yet, I kept responding to his every call to meet him at a certain location. I kept losing my clothes whenever he told me to, and I kept trying to twist and turn in the exact positions that gave him pleasure whenever he demanded I did. He was in total control of my will and mind. And the craziest thing was, I wasn't even in love with him. I love Andrew. Oh, I know I love him and not Steve. Never Steve. But for some weird reason, I still couldn't stop whatever mind control he had on me. Andrew, on the other hand, was starting to get suspicious of my abrupt leaving of the office, while mustering some excuses about work that never came to the office desk. And when eventually I stopped even giving excuses or trying to lie to cover up the truth, Andrew started to ask the questions. But instead of lying and trying to cover up as I did before, Andrew's questions began to irritate me. I was a grown-ass woman. I didn't need a man monitoring me, particularly not one that worked under me. Being with Steve made me feel so much pride again. I wanted to remove all the evidence of anyone poor being in my life. And sadly, that was Andrew. I became even worse than the last time we had issues. I gave him several impressions that he could lose me within the twinkle of an eye, and I wouldn't even be fazed. I gave him the impression that I was the one managing him in our relationship because I obviously had the money, not him. I gave him the impression that I could walk away from our relationship anytime. And so, whenever Andrew tried to talk to me about my behavior, I snapped, yelled, and threatened to leave the relationship. It was around that time that my mom started to pressure us to pick a wedding date, so I picked one without asking Andrew or seeking his opinion. I believed he just had to follow what I wanted, since I was the one spending more on the wedding anyway. Andrew was angry with me, but I didn't care. No, I did care, but I didn't want to be the one to apologize, so I left things at that. I let him be angry and tried to pacify myself with the thought that my reasons were also valid. All this while, I was still sleeping with Steve. He, on the other hand, didn't care about me enough to know what I was even planning. When I mentioned that I was getting married in a month, he had only shrugged and told me it didn't hinder anything going on between us. What other proof do I need to know that Steve was just in my life to destroy it? Not care about it like I wanted to believe? None. But yet, Another trouble came in my relationship when Andrew insisted on paying for anything that he wanted to do, and he apparently didn't want my input or my parents'. I, of course, had ended up turning it into an argument and refusing to back down. But then Andrew reacted in the most shocking way. That day. That horrible day. My parents had invited both of us over for dinner to discuss what we were putting in place for the wedding. Andrew had honored the invitation and had even arrived an hour before me. We were supposed to go together, but I had gotten a call from Steve to come over, and I left the house earlier, saying something about my mom needing groceries for dinner. But it turned out that Andrew had arrived an hour before I got there, and found out that my mom hadn't even spoken to me all day. I arrived there and made some excuses for the reason I was late. Andrew didn't say anything and just looked at me strangely. Now that I have had nothing but time to process everything that has happened, I realized that Andrew had not started to look at me weirdly that night. It started a week before that day. That was when Andrew had looked at me that way. I cannot even explain the look in his eyes. I just knew instinctively that it was very different from the way Andrew would look at me normally. But I shrugged it off. Andrew was just sitting there so quietly, and he only spoke when he was being spoken to. He just ate his food and didn't even try to speak to me at all. It irritated me so much, and I remember rolling my eyes at him. So I decided to irritate him back. I wanted to get a reaction out of him. Scratch that, I was desperate to. So I did that in the only way I knew I could get what I wanted. My perfect opportunity to taunt came when my parents asked what our budget for the wedding was. I said right in front of my parents that I would probably be the one paying for the wedding anyway. I got the reaction I wanted from Andrew, but not the type I was expecting. He had said that he would pay for anything he wanted and that he wasn't receiving handouts from me. I was livid and argued with him, telling him very clearly that he either did what I wanted or risked losing me. But Andrew had only smiled. In a wicked way. He smirked and then stood up and left. He didn't even bother to bid my parents goodbye. I was so angry, and I followed him back home. But instead of Andrew being sorry when I yelled at him, he only calmly told me that the engagement was off. The first set of panic set in, and I tried to keep things cool, but Andrew told me that he was serious about the break. He told me then that he knew about my affair for about a week. Apparently one of his friends works for Steve and kept seeing me with him, and he had told Andrew about it. When Andrew didn't believe him, he brought evidence. They were hard facts, undeniable facts. And there was no lying that it wasn't me in that photo in front of a cruise ship kissing Steve while allowing him to grab my buttocks so tight. There was no lying that it wasn't me in yet another photo, kissing Steve in front of a hotel room. And then Andrew brought out another piece of evidence, screenshots of my texts with Steve. The hotel addresses and the "can't wait to see you" texts appearing severally in most screenshots. There was no denying all those facts. He had been gathering evidence for a week, while I slept with my phone carelessly left beside me, forgetting that he knew my passwords and could access my phone anytime. Andrew had been awake gathering evidence for his revenge. He had apparently wanted a more exaggerated revenge and had planned to reveal it at our wedding, but he decided that he didn't want to push through with the wedding after all. Not after what I did or said. I was horrified and then desperate. Before that day, I had only ever heard of how stubborn Andrew could be, but never witnessed it. I knew I was at risk of losing him forever, so I did what I could to salvage the situation. I tried begging, I tried tears, and I tried regrets, but none was working on Andrew. He seemed to have made up his mind while collecting hard evidence against me. He left me right there on my knees, crying and begging for forgiveness. The one thing I thought myself too proud to do. I couldn't sleep a wink because Andrew had locked himself in the guest room so I wouldn't come near him. And he asked me to leave his house the next morning. He didn't want me around or to see me at all. He wanted nothing to do with me. It would have been less painful if that was all Andrew did. He apparently wanted me to suffer and not get away with everything I did. Because as soon as I arrived home with my packed bags, my parents sent for me and were so mad at me. My dad had never gotten angry at me before, but that day he would have probably hit me in anger if he had the chance to. Apparently, Andrew hadn't just locked himself up that night in the guest room. He took his special time to destroy my life and undo every form of peace I had. He had sent the evidence of my affair with a married man to the board of directors, my parents, and Steve's wife. My dad ordered me to step down from my position as CEO. He didn't want anything to tarnish his company's good image. I had no choice but to. My mother wouldn't even speak to me at all. I'm being given the silent treatment in my home. And then there's Steve, who is apparently in the middle of a messy divorce. He apparently had been spending his wife's money, who was a major investor in his company. His company had run into debts after his dad handed over the reins to him because of his careless handling, and he married his wife for financial gains, which are now successfully lost. The whole thing is still like a shock to me, and I cannot even fully process everything that's happening. I cannot count the number of times I've sent texts to Andrew and called him. But Andrew stayed true to his words of being done with me. He won't respond to my texts or answer my calls. He won't even give me a chance to apologize properly for the stupid thing I have done. I feel so much hatred for myself for causing this much harm. I don't really know what to do, to be honest. Everything looks like a complex life mystery puzzle game that I put together, but now cannot figure out how to unravel. Be honest, guys. Do you actually think there's a way to survive through this storm? Update. Hello, Reddit. It's been a whole month since my last post here, and I would have loved it if I had some sort of better situation to present, but it's sadly the opposite. Andrew has made his stand known by doing one last thing. He quit. He quit his job for my dad's company, and because of how good he is, he was able to get a job quickly at my dad's rival company. Dad hates me for it. He says nearly every day how I made him lose his best worker, all because I was, in his words, mindless. My mom just stares at me without a word, like she doesn't know what to do with me. She doesn't even speak to me anymore, and I cannot blame her. I don't blame them both. They raised me better than what I had become, but I chose a different path. And now I've ended up not only ruining my relationship, but also ruining a marriage. I should never have allowed Steve back into my life. I should never have felt myself mature enough to deal with everything he represented. I should have told Andrew everything. It's so painful to even think about him now. He was the sweetest man, and I pushed and pushed him until he was up against the wall. I betrayed everything that he represented, and I regret everything I'd ever done to him. He loved me and my flaws, and instead of respecting that, I chose to insult and test his limits until he reached his breaking point. I've never felt as lonely as I feel at this moment, and I can understand now very well why people say to learn from the mistakes of others. I remember coming across different stories of women who were just like me, allowing people who weren't even supposed to be in their lives in the first place to come in and destroy every good thing they've ever had the privilege of having. I remember scrolling through my phone, reading those stories, and cursing at them, thinking that it could never be me. I didn't know it was pride to think that I could never be like them because now I'm exactly like them. A woman who decides that her partner isn't just good enough despite all they do and ends up cheating and destroying the good thing they had going. Sad how poorly my life has ended. I really do regret everything I did now. It doesn't help matters that my dad makes it his duty to remind me every day just how disappointingly I've acted. It doesn't help that my brain keeps replaying every moment that I ever had to not do the wrong thing, and yet I chose to. Well, despite your hateful comments on my post to prove just how much you guys hate me, I sure hope you won't end up like me. Look at me. I've ended up exactly how those women did in the end, lonely and forever burdened with guilt and regrets. Thanks and goodbye.